Everyone. All right, we're being recorded. Welcome to the coffee hour. My name is Lynn Giacobbe and I'm the CEO of Kendal at Home. We're so glad to have all of you with us today, and is our continuing effort to provide a series of programs and talks that are designed to inform and engage us, all of us, on a variety of topics from arts and culture to current affairs. Members and their guests and prospective members of Kendal at Home are always welcome to join us, and friends of Kendal at Home as well. And I know we have a few of them on with us today. We hope that you'll continue to join us and join us often. We certainly want to acknowledge the Friends Foundation for Aging for the generosity and the grant support that they've given us to be able to offer these programs on an ongoing basis and help provide some support to organizations like the one we're going to learn about today. At the end of today's coffee hour, I'll give you information about our next coffee hour, which will be on August 13th. And I don't know about you guys, but it feels like they go so fast in between. Just want to let you know that as we begin the presentation, those of us here are going to shut off our cameras and you're just going to see the speaker, and Joan will be sharing her screen. And if you have questions, you can type those into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll be monitoring that. For those questions that can wait till the end, we'll present those to Joan and give her an opportunity to answer. If something pertinent to what she's talking about, we'll try to interject those at that time. But we encourage you to interact and ask questions as we go along. And if you have any difficulty, really just having your camera set for speaker view, you'll see Joan and also her screen. I want to introduce you to Joan Alakwa, who became the History Project's inaugural executive director in January of 2020. Most recently, she's served as the co-chair of the History Project's board of directors and as Harvard Medical School's archivist for diversity and inclusion. So you certainly bring a wealth of knowledge and information on topics that are so important to us right now. Joan's a member of the New England Archivists Inclusion and Diversity Committee and has a background in advocacy and oral history. She's a graduate of UMass Boston's Public History Master's Program and earned her Bachelor of Arts at the University of Puget Sound. In her free time, she likes to read queer romance novels and spend time with her wife and two lazy cats. And if you're lucky enough, you might get to see one of them as they appear throughout our time together today. And I just want to acknowledge Paul Duffy, our marketing consultant and extraordinary talented young man who's working with us behind the scenes on all of these projects, and Sue Whitekin, who's behind the scenes there helping to manage all the technical aspects of this. So thanks to everybody for your help today. We're going to disappear now, Joan, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn this over to you to do your presentation, and then we'll see you again in just a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. We will see. One of my cats has been sneaking around this morning. We'll see if he joins us for the webinar. And otherwise, here, I'm just getting myself all set up. And we can see that screen, right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for having me here today. It is really my pleasure to be able to do this job and to talk about LGBTQ history. So today, we'll be going over sort of the historical context of what does LGBTQ mean, how do historians study LGBTQ history with some examples of folks who have connections to Massachusetts, since that's where I am, but have much broader reaching influence on history around the country and around the world. And then toward the end, we'll talk a bit about how we're documenting this history now and how you can help to document this history and to document your own history and experiences. So what you're looking at on this slide, in addition to that outline, is a a flyer from the History Project from 1980. So we're a community-based independent archives, and we focus on documenting and preserving the history of Boston and New England's LGBTQ communities. We share that history with LGBTQ people, with organizations, with allies, and with the general public. And so in our collections, we have, or in our archives, we have over 200 collections that document this history. Some of the earliest examples we have are from the 1940s and 50s, and the most current are from last year. And those archives range from buttons and photographs and newspapers to t-shirts, flyers, bar ephemera, really materials that tell the story of the community over time. As Lynn mentioned, I'm an archivist. I'm also a public historian. And so it's my job to illuminate stories that have been hidden or ignored. And I like to acknowledge that I'm a white person doing this work. I'm a lesbian, but I'm also a cisgender person. So while these are stories of the broader LGBTQ community, I just want to recognize my privilege in being able to do this work and to especially highlight parts of the community that are more difficult to trace. We'll talk about language, but I tend to use the word queer as kind of an umbrella term for this community, with the understanding that people in the past didn't use the same labels as we have now. They didn't think of themselves in these terms necessarily. And also the word queer has been really reclaimed in the last 20 to 30 years to be an identifier for the community. Some people still consider it pejorative or a slur, but I'm a millennial and I grew up with it, so I have kind of a different perspective there. Most of my sources for today's talk include books like Improper Bostonians, which the History Project put out in 1998, as well as contemporary newspapers, archival sources, oral histories. And if you have any questions about where I found information or about where you could learn more, I'm happy to suggest books and podcasts that you could check out. So as we get into this history and we think about language around the LGBTQ community, LGBTQ as an initialism stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And these are all terms that came into really popular and widespread usage over the last 50 years or so. And they refer to a person's sexual orientation, their gender identity, and or their gender expression. And so what's on this screen right here is a really great tool designed by the Trans Student Educational Resources Organization called the Gender Unicorn. And it encourages people to fill this out and think about, how do you identify your gender? Do you, identify as a man or a woman? Do you identify as non-binary or something different? How do you express that gender? Is that, in line with what you were assigned at birth or not? And who are you physically and emotionally attracted to? And it's sort of, this is set up to think about these in terms of a spectrum, really. There's not there's not one right answer, but two, there's, you can kind of feel out what feels best for you. And it's really there to show you the difference between how you might conceive of yourself in the world versus how you might express yourself as well. And this is now being called SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression in a lot of places. But the terms in LGBTQ refer to these different identities, expressions, and attractions. So historically speaking, and starting at the beginning of LGBTQ, lesbian refers to women who are attracted to women, and that came into popular usage in the mid-20th century. The historical background of the term lesbian refers to the island of Lesbos, where famous lesbian poet Sappho was from. And lesbian began to be used in medical literature beginning in the 1870s to describe women attracted to women. Over time, it started to be claimed by the community, especially in the 1920s, post-World War I. in London and Paris to describe sort of communities of women interested in other women. In 1955, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons, who are pictured in the middle there, and other women began to meet and socialize. And they created a group called the Daughters of Bilitis. The Daughters of Bilitis was focused on socialization of lesbians, creating a place for women interested in women to meet outside of bars, giving resources to women to create a community in a time where it was very difficult to meet with other people openly. And their organization created a magazine called The Ladder. And when The Ladder was first published in 1956, it didn't even use the word lesbian. There were negative connotations to the word lesbian. It was still, although it was beginning to be reclaimed, still had this medical sort of deviant connotation. And so they called themselves variants. I'm not entirely sure when the shift to using lesbian happened. In Boston in particular, our chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis was founded in 1969. And in 1970, they surveyed their members about their purpose as an organization. And one of the answers that came up was, in particular, educational aspects relating to the lesbians. So by 1970, the term's really being used by organizations and people as an identifying term. Gay, on the other hand, has a longer history or etymology. It dates to about the 12th century, coming from an old French word, gay to mean joyful, happy, carefree, with a sort of secondary meaning of immoral. Carefree meaning uninhibited. Gay was used historically to describe people who worked in theaters, people who were sex workers, or even bachelors or bachelorettes who were unattached and up to less than savory activities, let's say. In the 20th century, we see Gertrude Stein using gay in her 1922 Miss Fur and Miss Skein to describe a homosexual relationship. And there's this shift, again, that happens around the same time as lesbian is being reclaimed, where gay starts to mean hedonistic or uninhibited versus straight, which meant at the time respectful, serious, straight-laced. Gay could mean campy, effeminate, and began to be used instead of the word homosexual. Homosexual is considered clinical. It was used to describe mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association until 1973. And so gay becomes the term that the community starts to latch onto. The other images on this slide include a picture of Prescott Townsend and some protesters in the early 70s. I didn't write down the exact date of that photo. Prescott Townsend's the second from the left in the photo in the bottom left corner. He founded the Boston chapter of the Mattachine Society. Mattachine was founded by Harry Hay in 1950, and it was an early homophile organization. Homophile, another term that was used for a short amount of time to mean loving the same, a less medicalized term than homosexual. And Mattachine was interested in unifying gay people, educating gay people in the world about what it meant to be gay, and assisting one another, especially in trying to repeal laws limiting the rights of gay people. Townsend, who is an affluent Boston Brahmin, meaning that he was born into a very privileged family who lived on Beacon Hill in Boston, had been a supporter of the arts throughout his life, a patron of the arts. He went to Harvard. He, during World War II, was charged with committing a lewd and lascivious act when he was caught in the act with another man. He had the money to pay the fine, but he thought that it was unjust and refused, ended up in prison for about 18 months, and then really became an activist after this event, going on to found the Mattachine Society and supporting early LGBTQ protests and movements in the Boston area. And so there's a question in the chat. the background of the names Mattachine and Bilitis. And so both of these names were chosen for these organizations because they could pass as straight organizations. Mattachine was chosen based off of French mask groups who would call themselves Mattachine. These sort of French nobles would meet each other wearing masks and anonymously criticize ruling monarchs. And so I think it's kind of tongue-in-cheek that the name was chosen for the Mattachine Society. We're kind of anonymously meeting to do gay stuff together in the 1950s. Bilitis was chosen first because it does have a historical connection. There's a book of poetry put out by, there's a book of poetry supposedly found in the late 1800s written by Sappho about her lover Bilitis, and they're called the Songs of Bilitis. It turns out it was a French male writer sort of masquerading as a lesbian woman writing poetry. But at the time, organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution and some others, the Daughters of the Confederacy, those sorts of kind of benevolent and society organization names were being used. So the founders of the Daughters of Bilitis thought, all right, we know that this is something kind of queer. Not too many people know who Bilitis is, and will kind of fly under the radar as one of these organizations. And so that's why they chose it and used it over time. And you'll notice these two organizations, they don't have gay or lesbian in the name of what their group is, because they were trying to create and sustain community during a time where being outed could mean losing your job, losing your home, losing your family, or among other potential issues. So that's where the history of those names come from. And sort of in comparison to that, bisexual, the LGB in the BTQ, dates to the late 1800s, also used in medical literature. Prior to its modern usage to describe people interested in more than one gender of person, bisexual typically referred to reproductive systems of plants. Bisexuals gained visibility through the research of Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues in the late 40s and 50s, when they found that 28% of women and 46% of men had responded erotically or were sexually active with both women and men. Bisexual organizations, the earliest began in 1967 in San Francisco, an organization called the Sexual Freedom League. And then after the Stonewall riots in 1969, a woman named Brenda Howard, who's pictured in the image in the bottom left corner, who was bisexual, became known as the Mother of Pride for her work in coordinating the first Pride March in New York City. And she and others are credited with popularizing, calling these activities Pride. Bisexual visibility really increased throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, especially after the Second March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights in 1987. On the button in the top left, you'll see that bisexuals are not named on the button, but a contingent of bisexual activists marched, and then they held the first national bisexual gathering that led to the founding of the North American Bisexual Network. So the term, although we're sure that people have existed for far longer than the term bisexual became popular, the term really starts being used broadly in the late 80s and early 90s. And then for trans, first, the images on this slide, several of them come from the Digital Transgender Archives, which is a really wonderful resource online about trans history. The buttons on the left are from the archives in Canada, and then the Fantasia Fair pamphlet and copy of Tapestry are both from the Digital Transgender Archive. And then the two protest photos on the right are from the History Project archives of the Wicked Piss protest in 2015 and the 2020 Trans Resistance March in Boston. And so Trans, historically, there are words that are now considered pejorative that have been used over time to describe people who are part of the transgender community. Transgender as a term was coined in 1965 by a Columbia University psychiatrist. And specifically, he wanted to refute one of these earlier terms. The earlier term that he was refuting was transsexual. He felt that that was misleading because transgender was more about gender identity rather than sexual orientation. By the 1970s, transgender and trans people, or the word trans is sort of the word trans itself was used as an umbrella term. Although we see members of the community during this time period using terms that are now out of date. And those terms might have included transsexual, cross-dresser, transvestite. Again, these are historic terms. I wouldn't use them now. They may be considered pejorative out of context. But we see really a strong claim to the word transgender as an identity term happening in the 1990s. Susan Stryker, a trans theorist and activist, calls transgender a term that encompasses, quote, all identities or practices that cross over, cut across, move between, or otherwise queer socially constructed sex and gender boundaries. Kate Bornstein in 1994 wrote, quote, all the categories of transgender find a common ground in that they each break one or more rules of gender. What we have in common is that we are gender outlaws, every one of us. And finally, the Q stands for queer in LGBTQ. And there's some debate over this. Over time, the Q has sometimes stood for questioning. I think that it still does in some ways. But for me, the Q is there because, you know, the LGBTQ initialism doesn't represent every term or identity that is part of this community. Other terms that are not included in LGBTQ but are identifying include pansexual, genderqueer, asexual, non-binary. Some of the others described on the slide: gender fluid, genderqueer, two-spirit. I, like I said, like to use queer as an umbrella term to describe the community. Prior to the late 1980s, queer was used as a pejorative term for a gay person. In the late 1980s, activists began to reclaim the word, especially activists fighting for increased attention and resources to people with HIV and AIDS. And queer in the 21st century is increasingly used to describe a broad spectrum of sexual and gender identities in politics. Although, like I said, there's still debate over its use in the community. What you're looking at on this slide are some other terms that are more recently used, including genderqueer to mean somebody who is, who might be trans or fluid, who might be non-binary and not associate with one gender or another, or as more than one gender at the same time. Two-spirit in particular is a Native American term that was created in 1990 to describe people who may have had traditional roles in indigenous tribes that were either a mix of masculine and feminine or something beyond that. What you're looking at on this slide is a picture of Geosakmata Neptune, a member of the Passamaquoddy tribe, who identifies as two-spirit and is the first trans person elected to public office in Maine, as well as a protest flyer from Burlington High School from the mid 90s, basically protesting how the school reacted to a student who was assigned male at birth dressing in feminine clothing at the school. So now that we're kind of on the same page about where these terms are coming from, like I said, most of them date to about the last 50 or so years. So as historians, how do we find LGBTQ people in history if the language has changed? And so we look for other terms or signifiers of queer existence in the past. The other thing to keep in mind is that history is either written about or by the people who experienced it. And so some of the sources I'm going to talk about today include people who had the privilege or safety to write about themselves, and other people we know about because they were kind of infamous. They were written about in newspapers, or we know about them through their court records, arrest records, or medical records. And starting with some literary figures, these are the people who really have written about themselves. And I like to joke, these are the people that you probably read in high school who are part of the LGBTQ community. So starting from the left, we have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was an influential thinker, poet, and transcendentalist. He wrote in his journal while he was a student at Harvard about his obsession with another young scholar whose name was Martin Gay. And Emerson waxed really poetically about Martin. We know that Emerson edited and removed portions of his journals later in life. But from what evidence still remains, we know that he was pretty obsessed over this crush for about 2 years. And his journals even include sketches of pictures of Martin. Henry David Thoreau, who's best known for Walden, we don't know if he ever acted on his thoughts about other men, but in reading his poetry and personal writings, you can really see his interest in romantic feelings for men. In particular, in 1839, he wrote a love poem called Lately, Alas, I Knew a Gentle Boy, about someone who he spent the summer with. And the poem is pretty romantic. I'm going to read it for you. So was I taken unawares by this? I quite forgot my homage to Congress. Yet now I'm forced to know, though hard it is, I might have loved him had I loved him less. And there are other examples in Thoreau's writing kind of showing that, you know, his attraction skewed toward other men over time. My next two authors are both local to Massachusetts. Herman Melville, who's actually in the painting, he's the fourth in the line, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's right in the middle. Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, set partially in New Bedford, in his home in Pittsfield, Mass. He had an intense and relatively brief infatuation with Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Hawthorne at first welcomed his attention and then totally ignored it. Hawthorne, you know, was born in Salem. He spent most of his life in Congress and Concord. And Melville sort of chased after him for a while. When he was turned down, Melville wrote a poem about the loss of his love and was very upset over the whole affair. And it was said sort of, I would say this is historical gossip, but Melville had an eye for handsome young men in particular. And you can kind of see some of his interest if you reread Moby Dick in the sort of really intense male relationships between the different characters in the book. Emily Dickinson, who's shown all the way on the right, was from Western Massachusetts. And she was intense in her ardor for several women throughout her life. And that includes her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert, and then later Gilbert's childhood friend, Kate Scott. Dickinson wrote a poem about a night that she spent with Kate in 1860. Quote, her sweet weight on my heart a night had scarcely deigned to lie, when stirring for belief's delight, my bride had slipped away. The majority of Dickinson's poetry was made available after her death in 1886. Her family didn't know how prolific she was, and it said that it was heavily edited by her family after her death to remove references to her female love. So while there are still some examples we'll never know how much was edited, changed, or even destroyed. Some other people we know about who both wrote about themselves and were written about include a whole colony of women artists in the mid 1800s. Mostly I'm going to talk about Edmonia Lewis here, but you're looking at on this slide, Edmonia Lewis on the left with her sculpture Forever Free, and then Harriet Hosmer with her sculpture of Medusa. And then in the final picture, you see Emma Stebbins who's sitting, and then Charlotte Cushman who's standing. And so Edmonia Lewis was born around 1844. She was of Black and Ojibwa and Native American heritage. Her exact date of birth isn't known, and that's partially because Edmonia mythologized her early life, really playing up that she was part of a Native American tribe in order to bring attention to and sell her artwork, which often worked on themes of sort of freedom and emancipation, the stereotype of the quote noble savage, and those sorts of themes. So Edmonia was born in upstate New York. She spent most of her childhood in Newark, and her brother struck it rich during the California gold rush. So we know that she had a relatively secure upbringing. In her own words, she described her teenage years as, quote, "Until I was 12 years old, I led this wandering life, fishing and swimming and making moccasins. I was then sent to school, but was declared to be wild. They could do nothing with me." We have records of her grades. She was a really excellent student, actually. She took courses in Latin, French, drawing, public speaking, math, and composition. She attended Oberlin College, but she experienced extreme prejudice. She was one of only 30 students of color and one of the very few women of color there. And after several incidents where she was accused of poisoning her classmates, of stealing art supplies, at one point in aiding and abetting a burglary, she left the college without graduating and ended up in Boston. She was interested in training as a sculptor, which was an art form that was really dominated by men. And so she was turned down as an apprentice by most of the people that she reached out to. Eventually, Edward Augustus Brackett, who specialized in marble portrait busts, agreed to train her. She became famous for her, like I said, imagery of, quote, the noble savage, her portraits of soldiers from the Civil War, in particular, the portrait of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw of the 54th Regiment in Boston. And in 1865, she had sort of gained enough both clout and financial support that she relocated to Rome, where she joined an active community of American British artists living abroad. It is not entirely clear if Edmonia was what we would now call lesbian, if she was interested in women. She never wrote about her romantic interests, but she hung out with a circle of expatriates that were essentially a lesbian cabal in Rome. The whole colony was overseen by Charlotte Cushman, who is an actress. Cushman had been born in Boston, and in theater, she appeared in over 30 male roles throughout her career. My theory is that she is the inspiration for Sarah Waters' Tipping the Velvet, but that's not, I haven't proven that yet. But Cushman oversaw this sort of feminist international colony in the 1850s and 60s in Rome. Other women who worked and lived in this colony included her lovers, sculptor Emma Stebbins, who she's photographed with, and artist Harriet Hosmer, who's shown in the middle there. And so Edmonia joined them in 1865, and she declared, quote, "I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain the opportunities for art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor." Edmonia gained international acclaim for her work, some of which, if you're local to Massachusetts, adorns the graves of Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. Her work can now be seen in the Smithsonian. She died in the early 1900s, and for almost 100 years, her gravesite was unknown. It wasn't until records became digitized that historians could find where her final resting place was, and a marker was placed on it in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery in London in 2017. Some other historic examples we have include Boston marriages. And so the two images that you're looking at here are on the left, Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett in Annie Fields' study, and on the right, an image of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis. So a Boston marriage was a partnership between two women who had the means to support one another. From the outside of this relationship, it could be or look like a deep friendship or a partnership. Some of them may have been platonic, but others were definitely relationships between the women who were part of these partnerships. The term Boston marriage was first used in 1886 in the novel The Bostonians by Henry James. And he describes how some women in Boston lived as husband and wife. And his sister Alice and her partner Catherine were the inspiration for the couple in The Bostonians. Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields were partners for several decades. Fields was the widow of James Fields, who was an editor and publisher. And after his death, she and Sarah Orne Jewett, who is an author from Maine, became lifelong companions. On the right, you'll see, like I said, Willa Cather and Edith Lewis. Willa Cather is known for her novels of life on the Great Plains, including O Pioneers, The Song of the Lark, My Antonia. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for One of Ours, and was elected as a fellow as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Lewis had graduated from Smith College, or excuse me, Edith Lewis, her partner, graduated from Smith College in 1902. And following her graduation, she relocated to Lincoln, Nebraska to teach. And that's where she met Willa Cather. And most interpretations of their relationship paint Cather as the author and Lewis as an editor or secretary. More recent scholarship suggests that Lewis's own career had a significant impact upon Willa Cather's creative process. They shared a home together in New York City for almost 40 years. And when Edith Lewis acquired a summer cottage, they shared their home there as well. They lived together essentially from 1908 until Cather's death in 1947. And the two of them are buried together in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And then we have a couple of confirmed bachelors. Confirmed bachelor is an ambiguous and euphemistic way of describing a gay man. A confirmed bachelor is unmarried, uninterested in marriage, but also uninhibited in socializing. British newspapers used a similar phrase, quote, "he never married," in obituaries to imply homosexuality. Confirmed bachelors were usually implied to be gay. Three men on this slide are confirmed bachelors. From the left, we have an image from the Historic New England collections of A. Piatt Andrew. He was an economist. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He founded and directed the American Ambulance Service during World War I. And he was a member of the US House of Representatives from Massachusetts. He had a home in Gloucester, and Historic New England has the guest books from his home. It was called Red Roof. And he had this sort of roaring social life. And through the guest books, we can see that he often held parties with other queer people, including his neighbor Henry Sleeper, who's shown on the far right on this slide, Isabella Stewart Gardner, and other artists who hung out with Isabella Stewart Gardner were often in the images and signed the guest book of Red Roof. Henry Sleeper was a gay man. He was America's first interior decorator. His home, which is called Beauport, the Henry Sleeper McCann House, is preserved by Historic New England, where you can see both his aesthetic interest in interior design, as well as his kind of obsession with George Washington. There are busts of Washington all over the house. In the middle on this side is Charlie Gibson. Gibson founded the Gibson House Museum, which is in Boston's Back Bay. He never married, and he consorted with other confirmed bachelors and participated in a bohemian subculture in Boston. Bohemian was another euphemistic word for gay. Charlie never had a long-term partner, but he stayed in close contact throughout his life with Maurice Talvand, who is the Count de Monet. He had a romantic relationship with Maurice in France in his 20s, and the two of them stayed in contact throughout his life. The Gibson House Museum interprets Charlie's queer Boston and talks about a lot of these connections that he had with other gay men in particular in the Boston area throughout his life. And so if you are in the Boston area, I highly suggest their tours. They started doing that just in the last few years based on records that they have in their archives. Finally, someone who we know about because of their infamy, and whose story we know about because of how they were written about during their time, was Ethel Kimball. So the story goes, in December 1921, John Hathaway was arrested on State Street in Boston on charges of stealing an automobile. And police officers soon found out that Hathaway was in fact a woman named Ethel. Ethel had spent the previous 2 years masquerading as a wealthy widower and pretending to be a graduate of MIT. During that time, Ethel had married Louise Aichler of Somerville. And before Ethel's arraignment in court, police brought them women's clothing, and they refused to change. Ethel claimed that, quote, "I wore men's clothing because I wanted to approach life's problems from a man's viewpoint, especially the problem of unemployment." Part of why we know about Ethel is because they had a long track record of arrests and often would give a male name when they were caught. According to my research, as early as 1911, we see Ethel claiming to be Thomas Scollins, and they try to buy a car using a fake check. In 1924, Ethel marries a woman named Pearl Davis from Parsonsfield, Maine. But Davis's nephew thinks that something strange is going on and reports the two to the police, where Ethel's true gender is found out again. Despite serving time at the Women's Reformatory at Sherborne in Framingham, Massachusetts, and the Boston Psychopathic Hospital, and being arrested and written about over and over, Ethel continued to dress and live life as a man. Although Ethel is not likely to have thought of themselves as transgender, I think if only for the fact that the term didn't exist, his struggles and his efforts to live as a man, imply that Ethel understood themselves that way and acted accordingly. And I think that they're a really great example of someone who we might now call part of the transgender community, but who never would have even heard the term during their own lifetime. And so, how and why are we documenting this history? And so if you've looked at, based on the examples that I've shown you here, people until relatively recently were not allowed to live openly as part of this community. They were either called deviants for their lifestyle. They had to do things sort of underground or only with the privilege to avoid arrest or bringing attention to them. And so the History Project, when we started in 1981, wanted to create a resource for people who are part of this community to be able to connect to their own history, to connect to the lineage of people who have been part of the LGBTQ community. It's not like when you come out, you get a book or, a family history. And this kind of takes the place of that. It shows us that we've always been here. We've always been part of the history of America. And, you know, despite gains that the community has made, that there's still work to do to ensure equality for all of us. You know, it really creates a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, and really connection to a community that has endured despite records being erased, records not being written down, or you know, the stories of our true lives being obscured over time. And so I sort of want to end this presentation with a moment to talk about what you can do to help. You know, first of all, if you are part of the LGBTQ community, writing and telling your story goes an incredibly long way. I can say just in the last few years, in the last 10 years, you know, people coming out now have had such a different experience than like I did coming out however many years ago, versus people who came out, you know, during the movement or in the 1990s or 1980s, and to have that understanding of like, what was it like in the past to not see yourself on TV or to only read about yourself when you were seeing people being arrested or something like that. It really connects people to understanding what the overarching kind of legacy of the movement has been, how different that is. We are always looking to talk to people who have hung on to things about their life. We document this history in the Boston area and in New England regionally, but there are community archives all around the country that do this work to ensure that the stories of the community are saved and are accessible to people who have so long been denied access to their own history. And I'm just looking at the time now, I'm going a little bit slow today, so I can answer some specific questions on like how you can document your history or where you can go if folks are interested in talking about that. But I'm going to stop myself there and just say thank you so much for having me here. It is always, like I said, my pleasure to be able to talk about this history. And if you have any questions and you're watching this recording later, feel free to email me at info@historyproject.org. I see that email address, and if I don't know your answer, I can find someone who does. And I also encourage you to check out what the History Project is up to at historyproject.org. We're currently working on a project in particular to document and share the history of Boston's Black LGBTQ community with a real focus on understanding what the community thinks is important about its own history. And really doing some crowdsourcing and focus groups around what are moments of community importance in addition to what are moments of personal significance in people's lives. So keep an eye out for more on that. And I will stop my share so that I can check the chat and the Q&A.
Hi, Joan. Thank you. You know, I had a question, but you ended with that that line about personal significance. What are you? Can I ask you that question? What do you think is a moment of personal significance for you in your journey?
Oh, I think, I mean, a couple moments that stick out for me are like, actually the first Pride that I participated in, I'd gone to Pride celebrations kind of as an ally. I came out in my 20s after college. And I like to blame that on, I was raised in a relatively conservative Catholic family. So it took me a little longer to get there. And nowadays you see kids coming out super early and just knowing the words and how to describe what they're interested in and how they're feeling. And it's really amazing. And that wasn't exactly my experience. But in 2016, I had been volunteering for the History Project. We marched in Pride and I designed our shirts. And it's not a great design, but I designed it. And we all wore matching lavender rhino shirts and marched the whole parade route holding signs with pictures of historic LGBTQ figures. And yeah, it was just one of those moments where you just, you feel the love coming from all sides. And so that's one that's of personal significance to me. In terms of community significance, Pride's been going on since about 1970. So, another Pride, another year doesn't necessarily have a lot of historical significance necessarily, but to me, it was a really important year.
Yeah, I could say that would be. What I was thinking as you were talking and sharing, the history, and we just a few of us here in our leadership team are just finishing up the SAGE initial SAGE training, and it was a lot of it was focused on this history, and I have to say that there's so much education I think that we all need around, even to have a coherent and intelligent conversation about, I think, what are such important issues. But one of the things that I wondered is who do you look at today as really having that kind of impact that, and, reading some of the stories and, someone going to prison for 18 months for, it just, it's incomprehensible today, but it still seems like we have a long way to go. Who do you think are the people that will look back in 20 years and say had the same kind of impact and really made significant progress in this area?
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of one date that I'm constantly fighting against actually is around marriage equality, which sounds bad when I say it like that. But a lot of times marriage equality is seen as like sort of this crowning achievement of the LGBTQ community. People at the earliest Pride protests were asking for or protesting and demanding that their relationships be acknowledged by the government, by the church. And that finally happens in 2004 in Massachusetts, where marriage equality becomes legal after a legal battle between a group of plaintiffs against the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And then on a national scale, 2015 is when same-sex marriages are acknowledged by the federal government and are allowed throughout America. But I think that in really the last 20 years, a lot of other activism that's had, I think, less screen time, let's say, than folks who have fought for marriage equality have really been trans activists. People who are fighting for protections for transgender people, people who are, and I had an image on one of the slides of a protest in 2015 where specifically Black advocates or Black protesters in support of transgender people stopped the Pride Parade in Boston and said, our demands are that you center these people, that you provide support to them, that you pay attention to the fact that trans people experience far more violence and other risk factors for, short life expectancy than other members of the LGBTQ community. And so the historical perspective here is hard to sort of drill down on. Often when protest movements are happening, people aren't super happy about them. And then with some distance from that, we look back on them and say, wow, what amazing work. ACT UP in particular in the 1980s gets that kind of rewrite now, where at the time a lot of LGBTQ people were like, you can't do the type of protesting that you're doing. And now we're like, if you didn't do that, things would have been a lot worse. And I think that's going to be what's going to happen with especially trans activists right now. And you see across America in particular bills, limiting trans athletes and medical interventions for trans children and that sort of thing. And so yeah, there's always work to do. Things have come a long way and they're so much better than they were. Not to say that everything in the past was terrible, but like life's pretty great in 2021, but there's still work to do.
Absolutely. And, I think maybe more people have come along, but there's still so many that, and, there's still a lot to learn, and it's about that journey never ends. Paul, any questions that you wanted to ask?
No, I Thank you very much, Joan. That was incredibly insightful and also very informative. And I think you're spot on that the freedom to marry does not mean the end of the journey.
Right.
I liken it to the concept that racism ended when Barack Obama was elected president. Right? Didn't
Right.
happen. I got married in 2007, and marriage equality, as Joan said, first in the nation was in Massachusetts. In 2000, late 2006, early 2007, there was work afoot in the state house by a governor that I won't name in Massachusetts, who was looking at old laws that would have prohibited marriage between any two people in the Commonwealth if their marriage could not be recognized in other states. So my moment was standing at the gates of the State House with signs and a very loud voice saying, we deserve this too. And I think it's really hard for people to understand always that something as simple and as conservative as marriage was denied to millions and millions of people on the basis of, quite simply, people, I think, were afraid of it. And people are afraid of what would happen. And look, I got married 14 years ago, and I don't think I single-handedly caused the divorce of a single one of my friends or family. But I think your point is a very good one, is that the work really never ends for any of us, who are in
Right.
groups that have been looked upon or considered as being other for whatever reason.
Yeah. And there's a lot of really great work being done right now to support, especially elders who may have been out during their lifetime and then feel like they need to be closeted again to get adequate services, in later in life, or even people coming out later in life and looking for resources about, how do I describe this? Are there other people like me? Some of my favorite people to talk to actually are grandparents who are like, I have a queer grandkid, or I have a trans grandkid, and how can I make sure that I'm being welcoming to them? And like, that's amazing. We're all constantly learning, and I know that I'm really in this work, and I'm constantly learning too, because things are changing very quickly. But whatever we can do to ensure that people have what they need to be comfortable, accepted, and to be as open as they can in their lives is worth the research and the personal growth. So
yeah, Joan, what struck me when you said that about coming out in your 20s after college, and that was so late, and I think, well, all of the things that you lived through and not feeling comfortable coming out, that's a long time. But I also thought immediately of people that are much older that have still never felt safe coming out. And I couldn't imagine, spending a whole lifetime, feeling that you have to hide that, doesn't change who you are. But that journey that so many older adults still feel today, young and old, who are afraid for whatever reason. And not for us to judge when is the right time, but I think about that, and I think about so many of us, colleagues, friends of mine. I have a friend who just learned that his son is transgendered, and he never knew, and he said, what did I miss? How have I not seen this? And but he's being embraced and happy, and she is, changing her life as she moves forward. But it's a journey for all of us, no matter where we are, where, what our choices are. But it's something, it's a conversation that has to continue for sure. Because, Paul, you said, those of us living in it, but we're all living in this, whether we're queer or gay or heterosexual or whatever our pronouns are. We all live with one another, and that inclusivity is such an important aspect as we think about it. And You know, it's a lot of conversations still to be had. And I think, you know, a lot of room for growth for sure, for all of us. And certainly a lot to learn, even just in terms of the terms.
I have to say too, that I'm kind of a little bit on the outside looking in, although I've been involved with Kendal at Home now for over a year. I'm so proud to be part of an organization in senior living and senior services, which is really having this conversation. And from the photo on our homepage to this program and to all the training that Kendal at Home folks are doing, it's very unique. And it's really says a lot about who we are as an organization and how we hope to build community through, you know, investigation and through thoughtful conversation.
Right. Yeah, it's so important. I think it's not something I don't think any of us need to hide behind, for sure. But anyway, Joan, thank you so much. It was so good to meet you. Paul, thanks again for connecting us with Joan, and Sue, thanks for your work there in the background. And thanks to everyone who joined us today for an important conversation. And so good to learn about all of this through your perspective, Joan. We'll look forward to talking with you again soon. And before I forget, even though Paul prepares me, let me share my screen just one more time, just to remind you that we'll be back again in August. And our next title is The Most Trusted Man in America with Mary Jo Binker from George Washington University. And that'll be on Friday, August 13th, Friday the 13th at 11 a.m. So we hope that you'll come back again and join us for that fascinating presentation again. And again, thanks to everybody. And we'll look forward to talking again soon. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.